Hi, and welcome to this series of webinars created by the Quaker Council for European Affairs on the subject of anti-migrant hate speech. We've created this series of videos to build upon the content of our Choose Respect campaign, which was launched to tackle anti-migrant hate speech in the context of the European elections in 2019. In this first video, we'll be talking about what hate speech means and what's being done to tackle it. Hate speech has become a major problem in recent years, particularly on the internet, where anonymity and immediacy lets people get away with saying things that they might not otherwise feel comfortable saying in public. If you've been on social media or a newspaper comment section in the past few years, you'll have seen what we're talking about: unpleasant language directed at migrants and refugees coming to Europe. In this video, we're going to look at what the definitions of hate speech are and why not everyone agrees on where the boundary lies between free speech and hate speech. We'll also look at what's being done by some of the internet's most important media companies such as Facebook and Twitter to tackle the problem, as well as here in Brussels at the European political level. Feel free to go back and watch again if you feel like you missed something, or leave a question for us underneath this video. So what is hate speech? Well, it's hard to define. One person's freedom of speech is another person's offensive discourse. What one person might consider sensible content moderation would be censorship to somebody else. The fact that we can't really agree on where the boundary lies is one of the reasons why tackling this has become such a difficult problem for internet companies. At QCA, we tend towards the definition which is produced by major European international organizations, such as the European Court of Human Rights, as well as leading online media companies such as Twitter. They say that hate speech consists of dehumanizing or violent language. That means language which compares migrants and refugees to animals, calling them cockroaches or rats or a plague, or language which incites violence against either one or many people of a particular group, such as calling for refugee boats to be sunk. Such hate speech is dangerous because it normalizes and legitimizes ways of thinking which undermine the civilized society which we like to live in. Saying that migration should be stopped is an opinion on policy, no matter how much we may disagree with it, but it's not inciting violence or comparing people to animals, which is really the definition of hate speech which we're looking at. If you're comparing people to animals, however, or calling for them to be killed, then you're negating their fundamental rights as well as their human dignity. And crucially, you're calling for other people to do the same. In the context of the internet, such views can spread quickly to millions of people, including a minority who may actually act on them. We've seen this before in Nazi Germany, where terrible horrors were perpetrated by people who had been prepared for years by a drip of hate speech against Jews and other minorities. And more recently, closer to home in the United Kingdom, the British MP Joe Cox was murdered by a man who had had extensive access to extreme right materials on the internet. These things do happen, and that's why it's so dangerous, and that's why we have a responsibility to tackle hate speech. Currently, migrants and refugees are the most common targets of hate speech in Europe, largely because of the Syrian humanitarian crisis of recent years and the exposure which it received in the media. And once again, we're seeing that words have consequences. A study in Germany has shown that with a peak in anti-migrant comments on social media, there is an accompanying peak in attacks in the real world against people who are migrants or refugees or perceived to be migrants and refugees. For example, arson attacks against shelters. We have a common responsibility to ensure that we don't repeat the mistakes of the past. So we can't just dismiss comments on the internet as something inconsequential. Together, they do have real consequences and a real impact for the lives of human beings with whom we share our societies. So this is an important and growing problem, one which we need to take seriously. But what can be done? This is a question which has been challenging both policymakers and internet companies for some time now. Should either of them be setting the boundaries of what can and can't be said online? And if so, where do those boundaries lie? We've already established that people have very different opinions about where the limits of free speech are. Some social media giants, including Facebook, have repeatedly called for government regulation, despite what you might expect. And indeed, these companies have taken a lead, such as by helping to co-draft the 2016 European Commission Code of Conduct on countering illegal hate speech on the internet. But big tech companies have an interest in there being a government solution to these problems, because regulation can be so onerous that they can force smaller competitors out of the market. What seems like a central solution for a growing societal problem actually turns out to be helping tech giants by the back door. And this isn't necessarily desirable. And it brings us to a bigger problem. Setting standards, either at government or private level, is one thing, but putting them into practice is another. There's far too much of this kind of hateful content for humans to moderate. and Facebook and Twitter have been quite clear that their algorithms aren't yet advanced enough to detect the nuances of hate speech in everyday online discourse. And even if they could, that still doesn't solve the problem of where the limits of what's acceptable lie. So we need a new response to hate speech, something which moves beyond simply deleting comments which we find hateful, and actually addresses the polarization in society which allows such opinions to flourish. Many key players on this issue agree, including the UN's Special Rapporteur on Freedom of Expression, David Kaye, who recently said that we need to move away from what he referred to as viewpoint regulation and move towards more transparent content moderation, but crucially, more constructive approaches, which actually change hateful narratives instead of just deleting them when they appear on our favorite websites. But how do we create these more healthy discussions in an incredibly polarized public discourse? Well, that brings us to QCEA's project Choose Respect, which we'll discuss in the next video. We hope you found this an interesting introduction to the topic, and if you'd like to watch again, then feel free to do so. And again, ask any questions that you might have below this video. In the next episode, we'll talk more about QCEA's approach to this issue and how Choose Respect made its contribution to creating a more healthy public discussion around migration. Thank you for watching.